What do you do when everything you've built, your career, your health, your identity, crumbles in what feels like a single moment? And what if that collapse is actually the doorway to your most authentic self? Welcome back to Awaken Your Authentic Self, the sacred space for soul-led seekers, empaths, and truth tellers who are ready to live from the inside out. I'm your host, Jessica Rooks, and every episode here is an invitation to go deeper into your own heart, your own wisdom, and the conversations that help us remember who we really are, especially when life falls apart. Today, we're exploring a question so many of us quietly carry. How do you rebuild a soul after everything breaks? Not in theory, but in real life, through illness, loss, trauma, and those seasons where the person you used to be just doesn't exist anymore. My guest today is someone who has walked that path in a profound way. Lee Carlson is an author, journalist, and Zen practitioner whose acclaimed memoir, Passage to Nirvana, chronicles his recovery from a traumatic brain injury and how writing, sailing, and Zen became lifelines back to himself. Lee spent 15 years as a student of National Book Award-winning novelist and Zen master Peter Matthiessen, and his brand new book, A Single Excellent Night, which just launched and already became a #1 bestseller in multiple categories on Amazon, offers an intimate look at their relationship, the practice of mindful presence, and the power of true mentorship. Lee's also an advocate for the disabled and for anyone navigating the invisible disabilities that the world doesn't always see, but the soul deeply feels. Lee, welcome to Awaken Your Authentic Self, and thank you for bringing your story, your heart, and your wisdom into this sacred space with us today.
Thank you, Jessica. It's really nice to be here, and that was a really lovely introduction. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. You've had an amazing journey, and I can't wait to get into this with you. So, Lee, you've had what many people would call the dream life: successful career, family, living in New York City and Central Park West, and then everything unraveled: divorce, business failure, your mother's accident, and finally, your own traumatic brain injury. When you look back now, where do you feel your soul was trying to get your attention before life blew up?
Well, that's a wonderful question because it's something that I still wonder sometimes. And, where do you start? In the beginning of my new book, one of the first chapters is a chapter about where, when does it start? Where does it all begin? When do you start trying to find your authentic self? And, you could look at it that it started with my accident or it started with my divorce and that whole time period. But you could also look at it and say, it might have been happening sooner. One of my first memories was going to my father's Sunday school class when I was, kindergarten age, and just feeling that there was something different that called to me, that there was a presence, that there was a spirituality that really got my attention. And then over the next couple decades, I would have moments like that again and again, but I would kind of tie them up in a metaphorical box, put them in a metaphorical box and tie a bow around it and put them back on the back corner of a metaphorical shelf until I really needed it, until I was really ready. And for those people who might even believe in the concept of past lives, who knows, maybe it even began before that. So it's difficult to really put a finger on when it all began.
Do you feel like there were any subtle signs, like early signs that you might have seen that you ignored? And if like, how would you invite our listeners to invite them to listen to something like that now before a bigger crash came?
Sure. So not only did I ignore them, but I kind of just papered over them and just didn't, it was a different time in my life. I didn't need it yet. And especially when you're younger, when I was in my 20s was when I read my first book by Peter Matthiessen, who became my mentor. And it was a book called The Snow Leopard, which a lot of people know because it won the National Book Award. It was back in the late 70s. And it was a time that was very different than now. I mean, now everybody's heard of mindfulness, and Fortune 500 companies are teaching mindfulness, and there are yoga studios on practically every corner, and we have a much more deeper and ready appreciation for that sort of thing. Whereas in the 70s, that was really pretty out there. So, and I remember reading the book and just being really stunned by it and attracted by what it had to say, because it
Mm-hmm.
was a book about the writer's search for meaning after his wife had died of cancer. But I was still young. I was still too busy partying too much and doing sports and chasing girls and all the things that young men do. And so as much as it was there, I just, yes, ignored is kind of a good word, paper over it, like I said. But I think it planted a seed, and some people, the seed takes longer to germinate and grow than others. And in my case, and also, as you said, I really did have a really wonderful life. I had a wonderful wife. We were very much in love. We had young kids. We had a co-op on Central Park West. My office was at 33rd and Park. I was a successful journalist. And we had a summer home down in the Hampton or on the Jersey Shore.
Right.
We'd go skiing in the mountains. I mean, we just, yes. And she had a really good job. So we had, financially, we were doing pretty well. And, a lot of people had looked at us as a sort of a New York power couple in some ways. And so partly I didn't need it, but even though I didn't need it, I did need it. I remember even during then was when I first started getting interested in Zen, and I went to a couple Zen centers in New York and learned a little bit about meditation, and I started to look into it, but I just wasn't ready yet. And so it just took some time.
Wow. I definitely understand that. I think I've taken a look at my own self. And at 55 is when I feel like, I say one of my guardians literally smacked me awake. And it was like, you know what, enough is enough. It's time for you to wake up and realize what's going on around you. Now, you call traumatic brain injury the invisible disability. Beyond the
Yes.
obvious physical and cognitive challenges, what did TBI do to your sense of identity? Like, who is Lee? And how did Zen help you rebuild a self that felt true?
Sure. So in my case, my accident, I was run over by a car, hit by a car,
Oh my goodness.
um, and I was briefly in a coma just for a few days. But when I came to, I literally couldn't walk. I had injured the part of my brain that's called your vestibular system, which is what controls your balance. So even though my legs worked, I couldn't stand up because I would just sort of fall over.
Right.
And I had some major cognitive issues. I had trouble thinking clearly, and also I had things like aphasia, which makes it hard to hear sounds. Like your whole world around it becomes this sort of wall of sound. It becomes hard to differentiate people
Right.
talking to you and things like that. So it really did kind of knock me for a loop, literally. But it also, I had to end up, I was in rehab for a year after that, and I had to leave my home, which at that point was on Eastern Long Island, and I had to go down to Florida to enter rehab. And my wife and I had already been having trouble before that, and we were already heading for a divorce. So the accident didn't cause that, although in some families it does. But the accident just was the cherry on top of the sundae that just kind of made everything worse instead of better.
Right.
And
Right.
I lost my kids, because we got divorced, and so I lost my home. I lost my kids because my wife got the kids because I couldn't take care of them. I couldn't work. I couldn't support them. And being a father was a huge part of my identity.
Right.
And so it definitely, I wouldn't wish this on anyone. This is not the way that I would say, go ahead and get run over by a car to find your authentic self.
Oh,
But
geez. Absolutely.
it did free me up in a lot of ways to it, suddenly I wasn't working anymore. I wasn't, putting the kids on the school bus anymore. I wasn't doing a lot of the things that I had constructed around me to create myself. And I also, as part of brain injury, you start really studying yourself. And I started studying myself from a Western standpoint. I had neurologists and therapists and neuropsychologists and people like that really helped me start to really look at who I was and what was my core, as well as that came at it from a Western standpoint, Western medical standpoint, and just Western thought standpoint. And at the same time, I had studied serious Zen studies about 2 years before that with Peter Matheson, who I referred to before, wrote the book, The Snow Leopard. And so I had already delved pretty hard into looking at who I was from an Eastern standpoint. And what really started that before the accident was the divorce, because I took a hard look at what was happening and who I was, and I didn't like who I was becoming, because I was becoming angry and anxiety prone and, short with my wife and my kids and all those things. And I just went, hey, wait a minute, this is not who I am. And that was
Right.
what really started me down the path first with Zen and with Peter Matheson, trying to, at first I thought it was to get a sense of calm, which was true, which is what I needed. But eventually, not even eventually, very quickly, thanks to Peter's guidance and a couple other teachers, much of Zen is really about looking at who you are. There's a very famous Zen saying, which is, well, it's more than a saying, it's a koan for people that have heard of koans. Koans are kind of these riddles that kind of knock you out of your thinking and knock you off your perch a little bit and make you think in different ways and see the world in different ways.
Oh,
And the most
interesting.
famous one is, most famous one that most people have heard of is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And that's a famous Japanese
Yes.
Zen koan. And the one that I started studying with Peter was, what was your face before you were born?
Interesting.
And that question, it seems so simple, but it's so hard to figure out. And it does make you start to go back and find your authentic self, and what was yourself before you were even born, and what was yourself right after you're born. Because the minute we're born, the world around us, especially our parents and grandparents and teachers, start to define
Mold
us,
us.
and they
Hmm.
start to mold us, and they
Hmm.
start to ask us to see the world in certain ways. And in extreme situations, they start to tell us who we are, or who
Yes,
they want us to be.
exactly.
Um, I was pretty fortunate. I had parents that kind of let me be who I was, but at the same time, you from day one, that's what's happening, is you're creating this person, and it may or may not be your authentic self. It may not be the person you faced before you were born. So
I think that's also very generational, also, because I'm kind of from that generation where they just like, this is what you're supposed to do, this is where you're supposed to go, you're supposed to study, you're supposed to go to college, you're supposed to, and it's like we don't even think to ask why. Because these are
no.
people that we look up to, and they're our family and our mentors, and so it's, you just kind of follow along, but your spirit is telling you something completely different.
It's not just generational. I mean, it is definitely generational, but it's also societal. It depends on what
Hmm.
group you come from. It's a joke, but it's true that, if you're from the Asian society, for example, you're much more likely to have parents who tell you you're going to be a doctor, or you're
Right.
going to, do this and succeed. And if you're from, Swedish background, it might be different. If you're from a German background, it might be different. If you're from a Hispanic background, it might be different. So yes, we get a lot of things coming at us from a lot of different directions.
Now, when you were in the darkest part of that identity loss, and we're talking those moments that no one else saw, was there a single practice, a phrase, or a teaching that kept you from giving up? And can you walk us through maybe one specific moment where that practice made the difference?
So for me, it was my Zen practice and really my meditation practice.
Hmm.
But also, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what Zen is, and much of it is silent meditation. But at its at its next level, it's also studying with a really good teacher. And I was very fortunate to have Peter Matheson as my teacher up in New York. And then when I was sent to Florida, he recommended another teacher in Southwest Florida where I was, who ended up being really wonderful. And so a lot of it is how they direct you in meditation, but they also give you direction in other ways. And so I remember one of my great moments with Peter is when he just looked at me and just said very calmly, just be Lee. Now, of course, my name lends itself to that little poetry, not everybody's name ends with E, but it was so simple and yet so profound. I mean, especially because he said it to me, we would have these meetings, these very face-to-face quiet meetings after hours of meditation, where we were both very, very clear and very present and really in touch with our inner selves. And so when he said something like that to me, just be Lee, it resonated, and I knew what
Right.
he meant. and he didn't have to expound anymore on that. And then there were many other times where we would talk about life and what was going on, and he would help try and direct me. And then I had a really, so that was from the Eastern Zen side. And then I was very fortunate to have this neuropsychologist in Florida who helped me come at it from more of a Western psychology standpoint and really look at my history and my past and who I was and who I was going to be moving forward. And one of the funny, he was a funny guy. One of the funnier moments was we were talking and I was complaining about the things that I couldn't do. And he said, well, there's something called neuroplasticity. And what that means is that the parts of your brain that have damaged, well, the parts of your brain that are still healthy will become even stronger to compensate for that. And he said a classic example of that, for example, is the singer Stevie Wonder or Ray Charles,
Right.
or Ray Charles, who is blind, and they, their musical sense and their auditory sense definitely became even stronger and better because they were blind. It was their way of experiencing the world. And he laughed and he said, "You're going to become the Stevie Wonder of writers, or the Stevie Wonder of Zen practitioners." I said, "Oh, great, good."
What a
So
nice
I'll take
compliment.
that.
Right.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's something to look forward to. So, but the accident, and I would take long walks on the beaches in Florida. And like I said, I had, a lot of time with therapists, both Eastern and Western, and I had a lot of time to meditate. And I had time to go for walks on the beach and really ask myself, who am I? And who do I want to be, and what was my face before I was born, and those sorts of existential questions.
Well, Lee, you've spent years as a Zen practitioner and senior student of Peter Matheson. A lot of people hear Zen and think abstraction or aesthetic. How did Zen look in the messy real life moments, lawyers, hospitals, bills, family tension, when everything was on the line?
Sure, it is a very misunderstood term, and I laugh. I keep threatening to start a museum where I'm going to collect everything with the name Zen on it. I've seen, Zen wine. I've seen Zen fertilizer. I've seen, Zen socks. I mean, and it is a word that's out there in the general consciousness, and people kind of have an intuitive sense that it means calm. It means being in the moment. It means being present, and that's all true. So that's good. Um, but it's also much more practical, and it has this reputation for being very mysterious and esoteric, which is also true. But it's also very practical. One of the reasons I was attracted to it is they say to you, just okay, sit this way and breathe this way, and just concentrate on your breath, and then that's it.
Right.
And just do that, and you'll become a calmer you. You'll become your better you. Um, so that so in the midst of, yes, the lawyers and the doctors and the divorce and the not being able to work and all that sort of stuff, on one level and one very basic level, it gave me a real sense of calm, and it helped relieve my anxiety. It helped relieve the messiness and helped me see that, yes, my life maybe was messy on one hand, but on the other hand, it's really still beautiful and wonderful, and I'm lucky to be alive. And but it takes work. It's like anything else. I would sit every day for a half hour in meditation in the morning, and sometimes longer, and sometimes at night as well. And then I would meet. When I was with Peter, I would meet with him 2 or 3 times a week, and sometimes we would have whole week, whole day long meditations at his house. Not just with he and I, but with a group, what's called a sangha in Japanese Zen, which is like a congregation
Right.
of 10, 20 people, not a huge group. Um, and so when you look at your life, and we were talking about outside influences before, there's also the daily outside influences, the radio, television,
Social media.
being bombarded with advertising, you're driving
Exactly.
your car too fast, all that sort of stuff. And so, if we sleep 8 hours a night, we spend another hour in meditation, there's 9 hours. Well, that leaves all the rest of it to try to knock us out of our authentic self, and try
Right.
and knock us off our perch, and so, I liken it, if you want to be a piano player, for example, you got to practice. You can't just sit down at the piano once a year and play. It's not going to happen. If you want to be a good teacher, you have to take classes and study and that sort of thing. So it takes time, and it's something you just have to make part of your everyday life, really.
So would you say, like, for the person listening to this right now who's had like a hard diagnosis, a breakup, a job loss, um, as a simple, concrete Zen inspired practice that they could start today in like 5 minutes or less?
Sure. So basically, you can go online and you can look at meditation. There, you can find things on YouTube. You can listen to podcasts with instruction. You can find a local group. I always recommend, yoga studios oftentimes have flyers up on their bulletin board of meditation classes and meditation groups that meet. And so that's a good place to start. If you go online and find meditation instruction on YouTube, it doesn't have to be Zen. Zen was my path. It's what worked for me. It's what I stumbled across, but it could be, there are many other forms of meditation, and just anything that gives you that quiet, that time to reflect, that time to have just a little time for yourself, because it's that time to yourself that is how you find your authentic self. That's how you find out who you really are. And in the beginning, 5 minutes is good. But if you can then take it to 10 minutes eventually, and then 15 minutes eventually, and you say, well, where do we get the time to get a half hour of my day to do that? Well, you turn off the TV for a half hour,
Exactly.
you,
Put your
you
phone
do
down for a
something.
half an hour.
Right, exactly. So there are ways. And part of Zen is really learn to be really aware. It's like you were saying before about your mentor who, said your time to wake up and, metaphorically slapped across the face. That's a very Zen image. There's all sorts of stories of ancient Zen masters hundreds of years ago that literally would slap their students across the face and tell them to wake up. So you need to become aware. Much of Zen is when you start to tamp down all the noise around us. And when you start to tamp down not only the noise around us, but the noise in our heads, in Zen, it's what we call monkey mind, which is basically, your mind is racing a mile a minute and you're thinking about what am I going to buy at the grocery store, what I need for dinner, I'm on deadline, what do I do for my client, I got to put my kids up at school, or,
I remember that
or I
existence.
have,
Yes.
yeah, and you're just going a million miles an hour and your whole mind is just going pop, 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 pop. So if you can start to calm that down, because there's so much going on, you have no chance to figure out who your authentic self is, because you're just, and I mean, that is your authentic self at that moment.
Right.
You are, in your job, or you are a parent or a significant other, or, whatever you are. But deep down inside, there's something else. And so once you start to quiet down all the noise, not only around outside of you, but in your own head, you will start to become very, very aware of something else. And that something else is who you are. And yeah, so that's a good place to start. Just find that quiet place. And that quiet place could be a walk on the beach too. It could be a walk in the woods. It could be just anything, but it's definitely turning off the TV and putting down your phone
Yes.
and that sort of thing. So
You mentioned the beach in Florida. That's actually where I found myself as well. That was my favorite thing to do, is just walk and then all of a sudden just plant myself down, close my eyes, and just listen and be present. And that was so helpful for me in the beginning, to just learning how to quiet my mind.
absolutely. And so the beach is a great place for that. The calming effect of the waves, the sound of the waves, sort of a sound bath that gives you, washes over you. And then learning to look around, learning to observe, because like I said, we're so much in our heads. You could be walking on the beach and just be totally in your head and not notice anything around you. And that doesn't help you a lot.
Nope.
But if you start to look around, you say, oh, look at that bird. Or, oh, look at how beautiful that blue sky is and that white cloud. Or look at the sand. Isn't that beautiful? And you sit down in the sand and you look around and you start to take the time. And eventually you'll start to see things in the sand you hadn't seen before. You'll start to see some shells. You'll start to see the grains of sand and the different colors. And you start to connect more with the world around you. And that, for all of us, if there's one universal thing that's our authentic selves, it is learning to connect with something bigger than ourselves, with something outside of ourselves, with the world around us, with other people, and when you start to realize, when it's also part of tamping down your ego a little bit, or sort of making your ego less important.
Right.
And when your ego is less important, then everything else around you comes more important, it comes to the fore, and you realize you realize that instead of being angry at that person and how different they are from you, you're like, oh yeah, see, maybe we're kind of a little more similar than I thought. Maybe we have something in common. So those are all good things.
Well, let's talk about your new memoir, A Single Excellent Night. It is really about a sacred relationship, student and teacher, man and mentor. In a world that glorifies self-made success, what did you have to lay down, ego, stories, defense, in order to truly receive Peter Matheson as a teacher?
Sure, you're absolutely right. I had to lay down a lot of things. And in our society, especially American society, we have this ideal of rugged individualism that comes from the frontier, and that's why we like Western movies and all that sort of thing. And we're taught from early age to be self-sufficient and I don't need any help, and men especially are indoctrinated with that.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, to say I need help is a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to admit to yourself. It's a hard thing to say to somebody else. But eventually, one of the reasons I sought out Peter was I was like, yeah, I need help. I'm becoming the person I don't want to be. And I'm, like I said before, I'm, becoming short with my kids and I'm being angry at my wife and I'm, snapping at coworkers. And I was like, gee, this
Right.
is not right. So, so when I first went to him and met him, and my initial thing was I told him what was happening in my life, and I said I need calm, I need grounding, I need a sense of peace and calm, I need to be a better me. And I didn't say I need help because that would have been too hard, right? I didn't want to admit that. I just sort of I couched it in other ways,
Right.
but I did, and I think it was it was not easy, and I had to lay down. You talk about lay down stories. That's so true because we come into these, and I remember. So he had a woman, a really wonderful woman, who was his sort of right hand person. Who he was only dealing more with senior students. I mean, he would talk to me, meet with me, but he said, "I want you to study with Dorothy because she's taking more of the beginner students." And she was very big on saying to me, "Why are you here?
Hmm.
Who are you?" And making you look at those questions and making you tell the stories of why you thought you were there. And then she was very masterful at saying, well, that's what you think, but let's look at why you're really here.
Right.
So, so there is some tearing down of who you were and tearing down of ego and that sort of thing. And I do think that you don't have to have gone through such a crazy thing that I went through. You don't have to have gone through a bad injury and a brain injury and a divorce and an accident of my mother, you mentioned before, all those things. Because I think all of us at a certain level have a certain yearning to find out who we really are and have a certain kind of underlying angst, a little underlying anxiety.
Right.
And that's why, that's why self-help books are so popular. It's why a lot of people go to therapy. It's why a lot of people just are still searching for something because they know that there's just something not quite right
Right.
and
Absolutely.
something could be better.
Absolutely. And you feel that, and you feel that in your spirit. Like you just,
Yep.
it is such a deep feeling. I remember that very, very well. And that smack, I was very grateful for that metaphorical smack. Because
Right.
I just remember being in the middle of an argument with, like, in my last toxic relationship, and I was at 100 when it happened, and I just literally stopped, looked at this person, and said, like, who are you, and why am I doing this with you? Like, I know that I'm worth something. Like, there is something to me that is worth more than what's going on around me right now. And this is not it. And I just remember laughing it off and leaving. And that was literally the last time I saw that person. So it's you that wake up call will come different for everybody, but definitely you need to listen to it, because I feel if I hadn't listened to it, I would not be here right now. I would not be doing what I'm doing right now. Now,
As they say, all things happen for a reason, as my grandparents used to say. And whether it's a toxic relationship with your significant other, whether it's toxic relationship at work.
Right.
Sometimes work things are just, there's a lot of work situations that can be toxic, or it might be, yeah, just lots of things. And it could be a health crisis as well.
Mm.
And you have to decide what you're going to do about that and that sort of thing. Or it could be, a parental relationship that's just doesn't feel right. So there's lots of things.
I tell people all the time, not everybody can follow you on your journey. And once you set up your boundaries, those boundaries need to be for everyone. And sadly, like you said, that could be your parents, that can be your siblings, that can be, and this year for me personally, there was a lot of that type of loss because I'm now the person that I am, and not everyone can appreciate who I am currently. And I said, well, I'm tired of being what everyone else expects me to be. I need to be who I know I'm supposed to be, and that's me. And now that I've found that, I can't give that a power away to anyone else.
And you're right, it can be very threatening to people around you because if they've known you and looked at you a certain way for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, whatever it is, and suddenly you change and you are acting in different ways and you're not doing things the way they think you should be doing them,
Right.
they can be very threatened by that and it can be difficult. So sometimes you have to just find ways to deal with that, but it's part of life. So
Well, if someone listening feels a pull toward finding a mentor or a spiritual teacher, but they're afraid of giving their power away, what questions do you think they should ask? And what red flags or green lights should they look for?
So if I didn't know better, I think you and I had discussed this ahead of time because this leads right into something that I'm very passionate about. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of people that are looking for a teacher, for somebody to help them,
Mhm.
in their life, are hurting and they're vulnerable. And sometimes they can get into situations where the other person that they find to help them is not always the right person for them
Right.
in a in a least sense, and in a really the worst case scenario is if you get to somebody that's controlling and might take advantage of you and that sort of thing. I actually, if you go to my website, which is leecarlson.life, not leecarlson.com, but leecarlson.life, because this is what we're talking about is people's lives,
Right.
and you sign up for, there's a pop-up which will come up when you can sign up for the email list. And if you put your email in, you will then get access to a 25-page guide called Find a Mentor for Mindfulness. And it's that entire subject. Like, how do you really find somebody? How do you know that you find somebody that's right for you? What are the red flags to look for? Um, it's in the book as well, but it's not as extensive in the book. And
Right.
there's a chapter like that in the book. And a friend of mine who's a Tai Chi master, he read an early copy of the book and he said to me, "Oh boy, that chapter, I wish I could just print that out and hand it. I get so many students and people are asking me, how to find a good teacher." And he said, "It's all right here." So I said, "Well, good. If you think that, then let's make it freely accessible to people. They don't have to buy the book. Let's just put it out so it downloads as a PDF so you can find that." Um, in my case, I'm a storyteller. I was a journalist, and so the best journalism I think is telling stories about people, and people learn from stories. I think people really, that's, you can learn from other ways too, but a lot of us, we really learn from stories. So my
Stories
book
plant
is
seeds. And like you said,
stories plant
you can't
seeds.
underestimate
Yeah.
that.
Yep. And so the book is really about how I found Peter Matheson, my time with him. I was with him for 15 years. The book only covers the first 4 years of that relationship
Mhm.
because I thought I was going to write about the full 15 years, but it was turning into War and Peace. It was just getting so long and so big. And I thought, well, that's not very Zen-like of me. I need to cut it down a little bit. So I stopped it after the first 4 years. It stops at, there's a very natural place for it to stop. But it's that idea of when I needed somebody, when I needed help, I knew from my previous exposure to reading Peter Matheson and from my exposure to trying to find out a Zen meditation center in New York City and that sort of thing, I just had a sense that it was right for me and that it would help me. And so I Googled him. I looked for him and I Googled him. And it was the early days of Google. And I found his address and I sent him a letter and said, "Hey, this is what's going on in my life. And I've read your book and I'd love to study with you. I hear you have a small group of students." And he wrote me a nice letter back saying, "Yeah, come on over." And we just clicked. And it's hard in the beginning because in the beginning you're not fully aware. You're just starting out. You haven't tamped down your ego. You haven't become aware of your authentic true self yet. And so some people can get taken in by the wrong teacher and by the wrong group. And so that's why I wrote that guide, because it's just there's certain things you look for, and I even have it spelled out, like they're in tests. Like one is the money test. If they ask for money, forget it, or a lot of
Right.
money anyway. I mean, certain teachers will ask for donations, but they don't make it a it's not
Mandatory
something you have to
charge.
do. They don't.
Right.
Yeah, they make it a mandatory charge. So that's one. Another one, especially for women, is the whole sexual vibe thing. If you get a teacher that starts to come onto you and you realize that's what's happening, well, there's another big red flag. That's just not right. And there are many more sort of tests that in that, it's like, okay, yeah, it's a very practical guide to saying, how do you find a group and a teacher to help you? And as I said before, you can start, on YouTube, and you can read books, and that's all a great place to start. But eventually, I am a big believer in the student teacher, student mentor relationship. Peter became, a real mentor to me, and he really there's an energy, and you're a Reiki healer, so you understand
Yes.
about energy, and so you will feel if you're reading a book, you might get some part of the energy of that person that wrote the book. If you're watching them on YouTube, you get some sense of it, but it's not the same. And especially because the teacher needs to get your energy. That's the important thing, because a good
Exactly.
teacher will tailor what they say and the direction they point you, what they want you to do, to your energy, to what's going on with you. And so, the teacher needs to be able to kind of read you and see you, and so what's going on. And one very funny thing, so as I mentioned before, Peter and I would have these meetings. We were face to face, alone in a room, talking. And one of the first times we met, he said to me, "Now remember, there's only one rule, and the rule is this is a time to talk about your Zen practice, to talk about your spiritual practice. This is not a time to talk about your life and whatever." Well, he broke that rule every single time we met, because he always asked me about my life and how I was doing and what was happening, and because he needed to know that. He needed to
Right.
know what was happening in my life and what my energy was, so that he could sort of direct me in certain ways. And also, at the end of the day, that is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to not have two separate sides to ourselves. The ultimate goal is to have a fully integrated personality that includes our quiet spiritual self as well as our everyday life that we're going through. And so, it's not like you go to this place and you sit for half an hour and that's one part of your life, and then you go to your office and that's another part. The goal is to really integrate all that, so that you're a very whole person in all parts of you, and so that you're just as calm and loving at work as you are sitting on your cushion in the meditation center, for example. So
Well, Lee, you could have focused on rebuilding your private life after TBI, but instead you devoted yourself to advocacy for the disabled, for TBI survivors, for people in tough times. What shifted inside of you that turned your personal recovery into a vow to serve?
well, I think the awareness of how many people out there were like me and that were suffering, and the awareness that I had something, that I had learned something that I could give back. I was from the brain injury side. I was very fortunate, as my neurologist said to me. He said, "You're one of the few that went to the edge and came back." He said, "Most people either had a more minor bump on the head and they had a concussion, but it wasn't all that serious, or they have a really serious brain injury that they never recover from. They end
Right.
up in a wheelchair, or they end up, with much greater benefits." He said, "You were really lucky. You threw yourself into your therapy. You did everything we asked of you. You came back from the edge." And so that was why I wrote the first book, because he said to me, "You should really write a book, because you'll help people." Because this was 2002 when my accident was, and back then there wasn't nearly as much awareness and recognition of traumatic brain injury. Now there is, because since then we've had the whole thing with the football players and with all the
Right.
recognition of head injuries and that sort of thing. But back then it wasn't as well known. So he said you could really help not only survivors but their families, because families have a lot of trouble when a family member has a serious brain injury, and they, their personality changes a little bit and they have other issues. And so he said, "I think you would, it would be a good service to everybody if you would do that." And he said, "'Cause also, as you're a writer, that's what you do. You're a good writer." So I did. And that his encouragement in writing the book helped me to understand that I had something to give back to people. And then the same thing with Zen and Peter. It just was so helpful to me. And I realized that there were other people like me out there, and that not just, from brain injury, it could be from anything, from a divorce, from a difficult, you know, um, significant other situation, from just mental health crisis, whatever it was. And that I had been, and the people that it gave to me, like Peter and Dorothy and the man down in Florida, Fred Epsteiner, they just gave of themselves. It was amazing how generous they were. They didn't, like I said, they didn't ask for money. They didn't ask for anything in return. They just gave. And I thought, okay, that is a life lesson. Like, I'm going to turn around and, still to pay it back or pay it forward or whatever
Right.
you want to say. Um, and it's that idea that, and especially as I get older and, I look back, that was, it started in my 30s and then carried into my 40s, and now I'm in my 60s. And so the people that were mentors to me and that gave to me and to help me, I was like, okay, I think I could do the same for others, and it would be a good thing.
Well, for many of my listeners who are feeling a similar longing, I've been through some things I want to help others, but I don't know where to start. From your own path, what is a compassionate first step to turning your wounds into a life of meaningful service without burning out or re traumatizing yourself?
Sure. So the easiest thing is just to look around your community and see what resonates with you, what you like to. This is again part of becoming your authentic self. There are so many ways to help others. It could be something so simple as, my brother-in-law is retired, and I can't remember the name of the organization, but he belongs to a group that they drive people places, people that are elderly that can't drive anymore, people that might have disabilities. He takes them to the grocery store, he helps them out. It's just his way of giving back. My way of giving back is teaching others how to meditate and how to find their authentic selves. There are other people, my mother used to, um, she would work as English for second language. She would volunteer to help people that were new to this country that were having, struggling learning the language, and she would help tutor them. And so there's, and
Mm,
also
I
for
love
me,
that.
obviously, traumatic brain injury is something that I understand, is something I know, and so that's where I put some of my energies. For other people, it might be, people that are with cancer. It might be, people with other kind of issues and diseases. But for me, I felt like this is my cause because this is what I understand. And if you start look around, you'll find lots of volunteer organizations. So that's, a good place to start. And then on top of that, the whole meditation, Zen, spiritual aspect of it is that keeps you from burning out. You mentioned burnout before. So it's hard to take on the suffering of the world, so to speak, and and a lot of times when you are volunteering, you are, helping people with their suffering, and you start to, if you're an empathetic person, you sort of take on their suffering, and it can really wear on you and burn you out. Whereas if you are grounded, if you are calmer, if you are kind of in touch with your inner self, and you're no longer the rugged individualist, you can deal with those a lot better. Part of the whole thing is in Zen, there's something called non-self. And when you really work on non-self, which is basically the, getting rid of your ego, then it's a lot easier to not burn out because you're no longer thinking like, why is this happening to me? Or I'm sad, or I'm hurting, or I'm whatever, because there is no I. So once
Right.
you really, and there's always going to be some I. I mean, we're human beings, but once your I is no longer such a huge part of who you are, it makes it much easier to help other people without getting burned out.
What an amazing story. Lee, thank you so much. Thank you for your courage, for your honesty, and for the way you've allowed your pain to become a path of service for traumatic brain injury survivors, for those living with invisible disabilities, and really for anyone moving through a dark night of the soul. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, Jessica, thank you for having me. It was really great, and it's always easier when you have a really good interviewer. So you did ask some really great questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, Lee's journey reminds us that even when everything is stripped away, titles, roles, abilities, there is still something unbreakable at the core of who we are. And that, to me, is the heart of awakening our authentic self. To those of you listening, if this conversation touched something in you, I want to invite you to take a moment and really honor that. First, go check out Lee's new memoir, A Single Excellent Life. I'll have all of his links for you in the description so that you can dive deeper into his story and his teachings. Second, if you're walking through your own season of loss, transition, or rebuilding, you are not alone. So let me know in the comments, what is one insight, one sentence, or one moment from this interview that your soul most needed to hear today? Your share might be exactly what someone else needs to read. And if you want more conversations like this around healing, spirituality, and living from your deepest truth, make sure you like this video and subscribe to Awaken Your Authentic Self so that you don't miss what's coming next. Beloveds, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for doing the inner work with us. And as always, may you remember who you are, and may you keep awakening one breath, one choice, one authentic moment at a time.